Hello and welcome. Today we'll be looking at expansion of perfect squares. Let's begin. A perfect square is an integer that is multiplied by itself to produce another integer. For example, 4 is an integer, right? And if you multiply 4 with 4, it produces a value which is also an integer. 4 times 4 is 16. So 16 is regarded as a perfect square. So the same way in algebraic terms, we do have perfect square. So when you have, let's represent the numbers with letters now. Letters like P and Q. So P plus Q squared is an example of a perfect square. P minus Q in brackets squared is another example of a perfect square. Okay, so what does this translate to when you are trying to expand perfect square? The first thing is that we need to understand the meaning of P plus Q bracket squared. P plus Q bracket squared is not the same as P squared plus Q squared. Okay, now let's use a numeric example to explain this. So let's say we have two numbers, 2 and 4. Okay, so let's say P is 2 and Q is 4. So 2 plus 4 squared will be what? 6. 2 plus 4 is 6 squared, which will be equal to 36. Okay, now what about P squared plus Q squared? So P squared, we said P is 2, right? So that is 2 squared plus Q squared, that is 4 squared. So what is 2 squared? That is 4. What is 4 squared? That is 16. When you add it up together, it is 20. Therefore, we see that 36 is not equal to 20. Okay? So that's one of the ways by which we know the difference. So what then is P plus Q squared? Well, P plus Q squared, when it's in a bracket, simply means P plus Q in bracket, another P plus Q. Okay, the same thing for the one with a negative sign. P minus Q in brackets squared is the same as P minus Q into P minus Q. So I want you to remember these two because it's very important when you expand perfect squares. Okay, these two are called perfect squares. Now, how do we expand perfect squares? Let's quickly do that. So to expand perfect squares, let's use P plus Q first. P plus Q in bracket squared, and we said this translates to P plus Q into P plus Q. So just like we have always expanded brackets, the same way we're going to apply that here. So we're going to use one bracket, transfer transfer all the contents of one bracket to the other brackets. What I mean by transfer is distribute, isn't it? Okay, so P into P plus Q into P plus Q. Okay, so when we expand that, P times P, that gives us P squared. P times Q plus PQ. Q times P, that is another plus PQ. Q times Q, that is Q squared. So when you add these two together, it becomes P squared plus 2PQ plus Q squared. So this is the expanded form of a perfect square, P plus Q squared. What about P minus Q? P minus Q squared, if you expand it, that's a P minus Q into P minus Q, right? So the same way we distribute the content of one of the brackets to the other brackets, P into P minus Q into P minus q. Okay, so p times p, that gives us p squared. P times q, that gives us negative pq. Then q times p gives us negative pq again. And then negative q times q gives us plus q squared. Okay, so now the two pq's, if you add them together, so that's going to be p squared minus 2pq plus q squared. So this is the expanded form of p minus q squared. Okay, so we have 2x minus 5 squared. So what do we mean by 2x minus 5 squared? Well, this translates to 2x minus 5 into 2x minus 5, right? Okay, so we can now distribute the content of one of the brackets to the other brackets. Okay, so that's going to become 2x into 2x minus 5 minus 5 into 2x minus 5. Okay, so 2x times 2x, that gives us 4x squared. 2x times negative 5 gives us negative 10x. Negative 5 times 2x gives us another negative 10x. Negative 5 times negative 5 gives us positive 25. Okay, so now we add the two values in the middle. That becomes 4x squared minus 20x plus 25. Let's look at a short method of expanding perfect squares. So for example, we have 4x squared plus 5 in bracket squared. So how can we do this? So there's a set of principles that you can follow. So the first thing is you need to identify what is the first term in the bracket. So the first term in the bracket is 4x, sorry, this is 4x, not 4x squared. So 4x is the first term. And then what is the second term? The second term here is plus 5, isn't it? Okay, so the principle involves squaring the first term. So you square the first term and then you square the last term. So let's square the first term. So square of the first term is when you square this, so 4x squared is going to give us what? 16x squared. Okay, now we square the last time. Plus 5 squared gives us what? Plus 25. Okay, so that's the first two steps. Now the second step is you will now want to multiply the two terms. Remember, this is the first term. Remember, that is second term. So you multiply the two terms. So that is 4x multiplied by 5. That gives us what? 20x, isn't it? Okay, so now that you have done, that's the third step. You multiply the two terms within the bracket. So that gives us 20x. So the fourth and the final step is that you now multiply this middle term, the product of the two terms, by 2. So 2 multiplied by 20x, that gives us 40x. So the last stage is to construct the new to construct the expanded form. So to construct it, we start with the x squared. So remember the sign, 16x squared. Then you start with, then you go on to the middle term. The middle term will be the product of the two terms of the two terms within the bracket. So the product of the two terms multiplied by 2. So it has a positive sign, so it's going to be plus 40x. And then you use the second term, the square of the second term as your last term, plus 25. Okay, so this is a short way of arriving at the expanded form of a perfect square. Now let's do it the long way and see whether we're going to arrive at the same answer. So 4x plus 5 comes to what? So 4x plus 5 into 4x plus 5. Okay, so we distribute 4x to 4x plus 5. plus 5 into 4x plus 5. Okay, so 4x times 4x times 4x gives us 16x squared. 4x times 5 gives us plus 20x. 5 times 4x gives us plus another 20x. And then 5 times 5 gives us 25. So now we sum it up together. That is 16x squared plus 40x plus 25. So we see that the value here is the same as the value there. So this is a long method of expanding it. This is a short method of expanding it. Let's try the negative version of that. So that's let's say this is a 5 minus 2x squared. Okay, so we're going to use the two methods. The first method is a short method. The first term here is 5, and then the last term here is what? Negative 2x. Okay, so if we square the first term, it gives us positive 25. If we square the second term, it gives us what? Positive 4x squared. Okay, now let's go to the next step. The next step is you want to find the product of the two. 5 times negative 2 gives you negative 10x, so negative 10x. Once you have found the product of the two terms, you want to multiply it by 2, so that gives us the value of negative 20x. Now let's construct our equation. So we can write the first term, because 5 is the starting term, so we're going to write it 25 plus, now the middle term, that is negative minus 20x plus 4x squared. So if we rearrange, it can be 4x squared minus 20x plus 25. Okay, now let's expand it the long way and see whether we arrive at the same answer. So this is 5 minus 2x into 5 minus 2x. Okay, so 5 into 5 minus 2x minus 2x into 5 minus 2x. Okay, 5 times 5, that's 25. 5 times 2x is negative 10x. Negative 2x times 5 is negative 10x. Negative 2x times 2x gives us negative positive 4x squared. So this is 25. Negative 10 gives us negative 20x plus 4x squared. So if you rearrange, it becomes 4x squared minus 20x plus 25, which is exactly the same thing that we got here. So you want to remember the perfect square when you have p plus q squared. It translates to p plus q into p plus q. Okay, and then the same thing with p minus q squared. It also translates to p minus q in bracket to p minus q. And also, apart from the long form in which we learned how to expand that, p plus q is, this one will translate into p plus q plus q into p plus q. And then when you expand that out, you have the final value. The same thing with this is p into p minus q into p minus q. So this is the long process of expanding it. The short process involves 4 stages. You identify the first and the second term. You square the first and the second term. Then you multiply the first and the second term. Then you multiply the product of the first and second term by 2, and then you construct your algebraic expression again. So that's it on expansion of algebraic expression of perfect squares. Thank you for watching.